Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this October's installment of ICNC's Educational Webinar Series. My name is Steve Chase, and I'm the Manager of Academic Initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I will be your moderator for this webinar. Today, we are offering a presentation by Isak Svensson on how ordinary people have engaged in civil resistance within Jihadist Proto-States. Groups like ISIS are back in the news and maybe even having a resurgence. Isaac's research is clearly timely and relevant. So let me tell you a little bit about Isaac before we get started, and I pass it over to him for the presentation. So Isaac is a member of ICNC's Academic Council, and he's also a moderator of ICNC's current online course on people power. He's a professor at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University in Sweden. His research focuses on the religious dimensions of armed conflict, international mediation in civil wars, and the dynamics of nonviolent civil resistance. He has authored or edited 10 books and over 50 articles, book chapters, and books in international academic journals and presses. He is a project leader of the international research project Resolving Jihadist Conflicts, Religion, Civil Wars, and Prospects for Peace, as well as the research project Battles Without Bullets, Exploring Unarmed Conflicts. Svensson has written several studies on nonviolent resistance. Currently, he is working on a book project on civil resistance in the context of Jihadist Proto-States, and the presentation today will be based on the research he's done for that. So the basic way this is going to go is after the introduction, Isak will do a presentation of up to about 30 minutes, and then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for question and commentary. And I just want to let you know that some of you may see the control panel. You can minimize the control panel if you want by clicking the little red arrow at the top of your screen. And that points inward. And don't worry about background noise during the webinar, as all participants are currently muted, except for the presenter and myself, so you won't interfere with the audio if you cough or if there's some background noise. Now, during the Q&A portion of the webinar, there are two ways to ask questions. One way is we would ask you to have your microphone or telephone ready, and if you click the raise hand button, and you can see it here, I'll know that you want to ask a question, and I'll mention your first name and unmute you, and you can ask your question directly. The other way is that you can type questions in the question box, and I can read them out and have Isak respond to them. So we want to also remind you that we'll remind you of these methods of asking questions when we get back to the Q&A portion of the session. And also, if you'd like, please feel free to post on Twitter at Civil Resistance or by using the hashtag ICNC webinars. Now, I want to switch over the screen to Isaac for his presentation on this unusual and very challenging application of civil resistance for rights, freedom, and justice.
The theme for today is Confronting the Caliphate, Nonviolent Resistance in Jihadist Proto-States. For the last 2 years and a little more, I've been leading a research team on studying the conditions and the outcomes of civil resistance against jihadists. The starting point for our project is quite interesting. We were doing research work on jihadist proto-states, and I'll come back to that term and how it is defined. We're doing work on jihadist proto-states and how they ended. And we came across some interesting cases where we saw protests attacks and non-cooperation and active measures by civilians living in Jihadist Proto-States, actually protesting in Algeria and Mali. And we'll come back to the case of Mali. And we were fascinated by these cases. And we started to look into the literature, the research on this. And we find that there was quite little. We went first to the terrorist literature. Terrorist literature has a lot of literature on Jihadist Proto-States, on jihadism, the background to jihadism, to the conditions under which armed radical Islamist groups set up states and start state formations, and the dynamics and the counterinsurgency, but very little on civil resistance. Then we looked into civil resistance literature. This is the literature I'm more familiar with. And there is a lot of work on looking at how civilians take measures against authoritarian leaders, dictatorships, how they organize themselves in self-determination movements, how they self-organize in terms of challenging colonial rule. But very little empirical work have been done on looking at civil resistance against jihadists. There were some arguments for that this could be interesting and important, but very little systematic empirical work being done. And lastly, we looked into what is called the rebel governance literature. This is an emerging field of exciting literature looking at the conditions under which rebel groups set up sort of institutions and try to act as governors over territories. This literature had looked a little bit on civil resistance. It's a growing theme in that field of literature, but very little on jihadist, the context of jihadist Proto-States as such. So we saw a clear lacuna which we wanted to tap into. The outline of this presentation is the following. I will say a few words about Jihadist Proto-States, how it's defined, and the basic context we're talking about, the particular context we're talking about here. I will say a few words about civil resistance and civil resistance against jihadists. And then I would talk more precisely about two important aspects of this, and that is to explain the occurrence, why civil resistance starts in some Jihadist Proto-States, but not others. And I will talk a bit about explaining the success of civil resistance. Why is it more successful in some cases, but not others? Lastly, I will end with drawing out the conclusions and discuss some policy implications of this. We will and then open up for some hopefully critical and constructive comments and questions. The basic message I want to get across in this presentation is the following. First, civil resistance exists. So there is civil agency even in the midst of civil war and occupation by theologically totalitarian regimes. Civilians are not only victims, they can take active measures. Second, civil resistance in this context is multifaceted. It takes many different forms, and we will try to discuss that today. Third, civil resistance is sometimes successful. There are examples where civilians have been able to push back the attempts of jihadists to govern over the territory. Here we see a man walking past the damaged mosque in Raqqa, eastern Syria, controlled by ISIS. And ISIS, of course, is the most famous example of jihadist Proto-States. ISIS was very oppressive against minorities and other ethnic and religious traditions, and had a very oppressive set of techniques. And this tells us something about the very brutal context in what we are talking about here. The concept of jihadist Proto-States come from the terrorist literature. Bria Lea is the Norwegian researcher who has worked mostly on this concept. And he defines it in terms of territories declared as emirates, Islamic states, or caliphates, and that are controlled and governed by militant jihadi groups. The word declared is quite important here when you talk about jihadists, and we talk about Islamic. These are self-proclaimed. So we come back to the discussion about the definition of jihadist later in the Q&A. It's important to point out that this is using the description of the actors themselves. You see in this slide 4 important aspects of Jihadist Proto-States. These are armed groups that are committed to governance. They have some type of aspiration to set up some type of state formation, a new type of state formation. Secondly, they try to apply a particular law, a religiously based Sharia law, and wage jihad. What makes them different from many other rebel governance structures is this particular application of Sharia law, the waging of jihad, but also that they are part of an international movement, the third box there, that they are part of a broader transnational movement, and that they disregard the current international borders. Here we can see some examples of Jihadist Proto-States. These are not all the examples, but a handful of the examples. You can see here of cases from Afghanistan, Somalia, Mali, Iraq, Northern Caucasus, and Yemen. You can note also in the table that the duration have varied. Some have ended, some have restarted again. Some have existed over different times and periods. Here we see the Islamic State flag at the government building in Mosul. Mosul is a case that we have studied in our work by doing a survey of 1,000+ residents in Mosul. And it's quite important to recognize that many people in Mosul initially welcomed ISIS and saw them as liberators. And when we surveyed people in Mosul after the occupation of ISIS have ended, our survey results show that the perception of issues such as corruption, security in the streets, and so forth were actually improved by ISIS compared to previous Iraqi government. It's also important to point out here that Jihadist Proto-States, they vary, they are different in substantial ways. And it's important to point out that they vary in terms of implementation of punishment, the type of institutions that they have, and also in the timing of taxation provision of services. When it comes to the taxation of services, Mara Revkin, a fellow scholar of mine, have shown that the Islamic State in Raqqa started delivering services since their establishment, but only started imposing taxes on the civilians after some month. On the other hand, Islamic State in Mosul engaged in taxation from the beginning, but the implementation of services was more consistent. So there is a variation in the timing of taxation and provision of services. Here is the case of Yemen. This is the port of Mukalla. This is a quite interesting case because Yemen have experienced 2 attempts of establishing Jihadist Proto-States. And it's interesting how the Jihadist groups learned. When they first set up the state, they were pushed back by tribal structures and civilians who perceived them as too extreme and too alien to the local customs. The second time was very different. They established a Jihadist Proto-States, and when they arrived to the city, they created civilian institutions, but they were run by locals, not foreign. They were conducted everyday governance. Al-Qaeda remained in charge of security, military operation, and dispute resolution. And to adapt to the local norms, they refrained from strict application of Sharia. They introduced measures such as religious courts and religious police force, but they were less strict in implementing different measures, including allowing women to stay outside after dark, forcing people to pay to religious tax, also the bans on eating, chewing cat, the ban on smoking and music and television was less harshly implemented. So now we turn to civil resistance. I assume that many of you are well aware of this concept. I will not delve into it and just shortly say that there is a whole body of literature and knowledge about civil resistance. And civil resistance, as I assume that you know, can be seen as non-routine political acts that do not involve violence or the threat of violence. So a set of tactics and measures that fall outside conventional politics and institutional measures, but also outside the realm of violence. The underlying ideas on which civil resistance is based is the idea that power rests ultimately on the concept of the people that is governed. And this creates a possibility for empowerment. Because if power comes from the below, if there's always a possibility for consent, this means that consent can be withdrawn. And the literature on civil resistance try to understand when this happens. Under what conditions will people withdraw their consent, and what is the effect of that? Examining the social roots of power. The underlying idea of civil resistance is that power regimes are upheld by pillars of support. And these pillars of support can be withdrawn and the power structure can crumble. This is general civil resistance knowledge, which I assume many of you know about and which have been studied a lot. What we try to do here is to see to what extent is this applicable also to the context of Jihadist Proto-States. This draws from a study with local protests in Syria, which we have used, where we have used Arab-speaking social media in order to collect data on village-level protests behavior. We have collected over 600 cases of protests that are directed towards ISIS, al-Nusra, or other jihadist, Salafi jihadist armed actors. It's important to note that there is a clustering in time and space, meaning that many of the protests occur after each other or in close neighborhood to each other. It's also important to note that there is a variation in the demands. The most common of the protest type of demand were the demands of civilians of the armed groups to stop fighting. 37% of the protest related to quest about demanding the armed actors to stop fight. 26% of the protest, the demands were about leaving the city. The villages wanted the jihadists to leave the cities. There were other smaller demands as well, including 7% that were related to release a particular prisoner. These are examples from the case of Mali in 2012. You can see here the first one is locals form a protective belt around ancient tombs. The second one is civilians preventing jihadists to enter the mosque for Friday prayers. Quite powerful symbolic action that has a quite profound religious meaning. And third, Mali, the third case for Mali, you see the Tuareg women protesting after Ansar Dine, one of the Salafi jihadist rebel groups, decided that they must wear the veil and ban them from participating in economic ventures. When we study the case of Mali, and where we contrast this to other cases where civil resistance did not occur, there are two factors that stand out. First of all, we can see that civil resistance against jihadists occur when there is a sense of alienation, when the jihadists are perceived as foreigners. Remember how we defined Jihadist Proto-States. They are transnational movements. That's one of their strengths, you can say, that they get access to international networks. But that also makes them vulnerable. It makes them in a situation, it puts them in a situation where they risk to be pushed back against, that they are seen as alien. They are not seen as attuned to the local customs. In Mali, have a long ancient history of practicing a very tolerant form, a pluralistic form of Islam that clashed severely with the Salafi jihadist interpretation. The second factor that we can see that when we study Mali and compare that to other cases where civil resistance did not occur is that civil resistance used pre-existing civil society actors to mobilize. Women's group, youth groups, labor movements, and so forth. When there were pre-existing civil society structures, they could be used to mobilize against the jihadists. When such proto-states were missing, it was less likely that you could see civil resistance. These graphs draw from the study that we did in Mosul a year back, where we did a survey of 1,000 women and men that have lived under ISIS occupation. And we asked them about their experiences. And in particular, we asked them about whether they took any form of action of dissent, if they took any active measures of resistance against ISIS. There are issues, obvious issues in relation to self-reporting resistance afterhands, and we can come back to that if you're interested in that question about social desirability bias and how we try to mitigate those. But anyway, it's interesting to note the type of the plurality of civil resistance actions that were taken in Mosul. We divide it into three different groups. First of all, it was public actions that included protest, speaking out publicly, making declarations, confronting ISIS representatives in public, wearing symbolic marks and making banners and so forth. So taking public action. That was quite uncommon. A lot of people did not engage in that type of behavior, and that's not so surprising given the high-risk nature of public action. Much more common was non-cooperation. That included refusal to participate in the school system, refusal to pay tax, to refuse to cooperate with the ISIS institutions in various forms and measures. The most prevalent, what can be called everyday resistance. These are measures of resistance which is not necessarily political. It's not necessarily something that is done in a collective way. It can be done in the everyday lived experience, where you're not fully obliged to the codes and to the legislations of the rulers. ISIS was a totalitarian regime, set up a totalitarian regime, regulating each and every aspect of individual life. This means that there was also room for everyday resistance. This included smoking, playing music, if you're a woman, to show your hair, to go out in public, and other such forms. And we can see that quite a lot of people did not fully oblige to ISIS' very strict rule, and did engage and self-report that they engaged in everyday resistance. Here we can see some interesting examples from the study that we have on Syria on the success of civil resistance. We can see after 1,000 protesters demanded the Al-Nusra branch, HTS, to leave the area, there was a negotiated agreement through which they left. The second example here is demonstration demanding a stop in fighting, which resulted in a ceasefire. And the third one is activists protesting against the arrest of doctors working for a medical NGO, and the rebel group released the captives. It's interesting here that when you start to look at success or outcomes, you have to have a quite fine-grained analysis. So we're not talking about success in ultimately collapsing of the Jihadist Proto-States, but a more fine-grained type of analysis. When we try to explain it, we look into the civil resistance literature, especially the literature on resource mobilization, which points out that in situations where there's been past protest, when the participation is broad across different cleavages of the society, and where you are able to have simultaneous events, it's more likely that you have success. These concepts that you see here, resource mobilization, political jujutsu, moderate goals, comes as no surprise for those of you who have studied civil resistance. These are conventional theories in civil resistance. And I think that's important to point out, that there is a conventional theory, so to say, mainstream theory of civil resistance actually applies to this context as well. Here we can see the illustration of political jujutsu. I will not go into that, but because I'm running out of time. So I'll happy to come back to that in the Q&A. I'm rounding up here, and I want to underline that what we want to show in our research is that civil resistance is possible, even in extremely repressive conditions, that it can take many different forms, sometimes very subtle forms, and that it can be successful even against Jihadist Proto-States. There are several important policy implications that follow from our research. There are some sort of general implications about the importance of decreasing the strength of Jihadist Proto-States, for instance, by improving governance or by taking measures to prevent recruitment of foreign fighters. But there is also some important policy implications when we start to think about civil resistance as such. And one important implication is the importance of strengthening the civil society networks, as we can see that these play a key role in explaining the onset of civil resistance and its success. It's also important that media more fully share the experience of civil resistance in order to get more display of these types of resistance behavior, as well as to report acts of repression in order to decrease the potential for backfiring. And overall, I think our research shows that it's important to acknowledge that there is a variation in different forms of resistance, that resistance is indeed multifaceted. With this, before turning over to the Q&A, I would like to acknowledge the great collaboration that I had in this research project. And here are the research team: Luis Martinez Lorenzo, Dino Krause, Daniel Finnbogason, Nanar Hawash, Marie Riquer, Wing Ha, that has all been working as research assistant on this project. And together with Dr. Jonathan Hall, Dogan Karkus, and Erik Skog, have been able to implement the survey in Mosul. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's two ways for participants to ask questions, which we mentioned before, but one is people can signify by raising their hands, and then I can acknowledge you and unmute you, and you can ask a question. And then the other thing is people can type into the question box, and then I can share that with Ishak. But let me just check right now to see if there's anybody with their hand raised. And yeah, we have somebody. So Stephen, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question of Ishak.
Great. This is excellent. Thank you very much. First of all, if you haven't seen it, you might want to check out an article I did with a Yemeni colleague a few years ago. It was published in Open Democracy. It was primarily about nonviolent resistance to areas controlled by the Houthis, but did include a couple examples of resistance to Al-Qaeda areas as well. My question involving your research is I was wondering if you included as a variable or the simultaneous armed activity, whether it be armed resistance in the area or bombing by outside forces. For example, one could argue that knowing that they had outside support, it might embolden people to resist more. Or on the other hand, of course, when you're being bombed, you tend to hunker down, and some people might even rally around the flag. And so I was wondering if you looked at the question of simultaneous military activity.
Can I speak now? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephen, for your question. A very, very good question. I think the question about simultaneous activity, military activities, is a very good one. And there are several cases where this happened and where it did play a key role. So some of the cases that we saw sort of success in some extent, the Mali case, cases in Algeria as well to some extent. These were civil resistance campaigns that took place at the same time as they had military operations. And there is an interesting observation to be made here, and that is that we have relatively few cases. We have a lack of variation, so to say, in terms of that we almost exclusively, as far as we can tell, have simultaneous armed activities going on. So the Jihadist Proto-States are set up in a context where you have civil wars ongoing, where you have military conflict already occurring at the same time. So you have simultaneous armed activities. And we have that makes it difficult also to disentangle the effect of the military action versus the civilian actions. And we don't have any case, as far as we have sort of found, any clear case of only relying on civil resistance. There's always been a sort of a big mixture. We have not looked into the activities of armed actions, and that is because previous research has overwhelmingly examined armed actors. We don't question that armed activities can be important. It's just that we don't pay attention to it in our research because previous research has already studied it a lot. There's a lot of work on sort of counterinsurgency. This is actually a dominating theme if you look at on the sort of terrorism literature. That said, I think that the question about how the simultaneous when you have a simultaneous armed activity, how that influences the potentials for civil resistance, and you outline two diverting, very interesting hypotheses there, is a very interesting one and should be studied. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Isak. We have another question from Doug, and Doug, I'll unmute you. And he has an illustration outside of Damascus that he wanted to share of civil resistance, and then you can comment on it based on your research. Doug, go ahead.
Hi, this was from several years ago when I was working for the Mennonite Central Committee. We were sending material aid into communities through the Syrian Orthodox Church, and they were distributing it not to Christians, but to people in need. And we were working with a congregation which was some miles outside of Damascus, and been giving aid to the community through the church for several years. Then that community was overrun by one of the jihadist groups, and they came in and wanted to blow up the church. And the community people, the Arabs in the community, surrounded the church and said, no, you may not destroy this church. This church has been helping us when we have been in need. And they, in fact, saved the church.
So Isak, how does that illustration, it sounds a little like one of the examples you gave about Mali.
Yes, thank you, Doug, for raising this and sharing this example. I think it's a very, very good and strong example. And we have several other examples that we find in our material, where you see communities that rise up, also taking active measures to protect members of other faith traditions or other ethnic groups or other communities. And I think it shows, it speaks to one of the things that I said in my presentation, the role of civil society. Here you talk about the role of churches, religious communities that build up gradually trust over time, that build connections between people, that cut across divisions in societies. And I think this is so important to focus on and to show that these also have effects in time of crisis. And the kind of work that you shared is often long-term commitment to gradually build up contact and establish contact and sort of help with assistance in various forms. That can then be a key role when you come to this kind of crisis that you described. So thank you very much for that, sharing that example.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to encourage people to, I'm beginning to see questions being typed into the question box, and that's great. I'll try to get to all of them if we can. And other people who want to raise their hand electronically, I can see you and recognize you. There's a question here, which I think might be common on many people's mind, whether they're on this webinar or not, but to what degree can nonviolent action work in such repressive regimes? And I'm wondering if you might want to go back to your slide on political jiu-jitsu and talk about that. I can change over the presentation so you have the slides, Isak, if you think that would be relevant.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about repression, and of course this is a key item. So thank you for raising that, whoever it was. I think there are two important points to point out here. Yes, there is variation when it comes to civil resistance in terms of allowing space for civil resistance. So, for instance, when we look at different rebel groups and the local protests in Syria, we could see that HTS and Al-Nusra, which was very repressive, but on the scale at least, a little bit less repressive than ISIS. Then they also experienced more civil resistance. So there were relatively little experience against outright protest, that is, which we studied in the case of Syria. So the most public form, right? Remember that. And of course, if you have a very repressive regime, then it's difficult to have outright protests. But remember that there are other forms of protests, and there are more low risk activities. That includes a whole range of activities that could be ranked under non-cooperation. So there are possibilities to refuse to participate in school or to refuse to pay tax and so forth, which can have very strong effect on the attempts of jihadist groups to set up a proto-states. But implementing it can be less risky for the activists or the civilians. We should also remember that repression can work to repress civil resistance, but sometimes it can also backfire. And many of you, I assume, know the concept of political jujutsu, such a central concept in the study of civil resistance, which is a concept around explaining when repression actually sort of hit backs on the repressor, the actor who's taking the repressive measures. Here we can see in the slide here examples of this. In the first citation here, quote here, you see HJ's member tried to repress us in several ways, but when they did, more people joined us and refused them. And this is exactly an example of political jujutsu. When the rebel groups try to repress, it can sometimes backfire, leading to those that have been passive observers taking the stance of the civil resistors. The other quote here: in 2016, one night, HJs arrested several civilians and activists in an attempt to stop the growing demonstrations from getting more momentum, but it rather had a different result. The next day, we stormed the headquarters and kicked them out of it. So it's interesting here to see that kind of dynamic that we have been discussing for many years in the study of civil resistance being played out also against jihadi rebel rulers.
Then there's also another question here that seems like a very good one from Rana. And she's saying, regarding civil resistance in such situations, is it usually locally done, or is there a connection to foreign support and financial aid to those who are engaging in resistance to jihadist proto-states?
Thank you, Mona, for raising a very important questions. It is one that I can only talk about tentatively because we don't have any hard evidence. It's quite difficult overall to get the access to this material. So just to identify these cases has been a hard work. And to get information, systematic information on their linkages to foreign groups is not something that we have been able to do. I think it's a really good idea to play it out. My impression from working on the data, but bear with me just sharing my impression and not having any hard evidence to back this up, is that most of this is homegrown. most of this is very local, very domestic. It may be resulting from civil society organizations that have had international support in different ways, but it is definitely not something that is sort of orchestrated from outside. It's something that to large extent has grown domestically and in sort of internal, not something that has grown from and relied on support from external states and so forth. That said, we also see cases where there have been actions taken of solidarity, so to say, by the international community. I'm thinking about the campaigns for the kidnapped women in Boko Haram, where leading international figures also joined the international campaign to champion the rights of the women, to kidnap women, to be released. That was a local campaign that was also very internationally supported. But the support was primarily moral, I would say. It was a support to show that it was a great wider audience supporting this demand. But thank you so much for raising the nexus between the international and domestic. I think that's something that I would that's worthwhile to study in greater depth and detail. Thank you.
So we have another question, which is, it seems from your presentation and research that there hasn't been the kind of sort of nonviolent revolution or overthrow of a proto-jihadist state at this point in time. And you were talking about moderate goals. So the question that the participant had was to say more about these reforms, about improving conditions rather than overthrowing the proto-state, but how you see that playing out, and do you see it ever possible that the experience may develop to the point that civil resistance could actually end the proto-state and replace it?
Thank you very much. I think it's a really important and interesting question. So we have not seen any clear case where a jihadist proto-state have collapsed only and solely because of a non-violent resistance. That's true. On the other hand, we have not seen a full-scale non-violent resistant campaign to try to overthrow jihadist proto-states. So we don't know whether, if implemented on a large scale, it would be effective or not. What we can study then is variations on a lower scale, and here we can see something that at least resonate with overthrows. So if we talk about the local village, we can see that there have been the dominating, one of the most important demands that have been made and campaigns that have been made have been for jihadist groups to leave and to basically move away from a particular city or a particular village. And this, to my extent, resonate with the sort of a local overthrow, if you wish. Some type of demands that they should not be in this particular area. And that we see quite a lot of success in terms of civilians being able to successfully resist the jihadists from being in a particular village, throwing them out, not allowing them to be there. There are other sort of demands in there. I mentioned the release of political prisoners. It could be social conditions. There could be economic conditions that they are demanding. So there are other forms that are sort of non-maximalist demands that also exist, that not have to do with sort of challenging the underlying ideology or the underlying legitimacy of the group, but rather demanding particular changes. And that's quite common as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to go back to the slide about how to ask questions so other people can just be reminded if there's questions. Another one that we have is you mentioned in the slide where you were talking about Mali in 2012 and you had 3 examples. And in one you talked about women protesting orders to wear veils. And the participant had a question of just, what was the nature of the protests? What were the details or the tactics used in that particular protest, and wanting to know more about what the outcome was?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's interesting to note that in the case of Mali, women organization overall played a quite active role. So women were often in the lead of taking up civil resistance. This has partly to do with that the men were away fighting, so that there were predominantly women that existed, but also that women in Mali traditionally have a quite, at least compared to some other cases that we have been studying, have a quite strong social position. And this is also the context in which this particular event occurred. That the women in Mali felt threatened and felt that their rights and room for empowerment were being challenged. And they took various measures, including demonstrations, active demonstrations, and confronting the jihadists directly, going on sort of one-on-one on the jihadist foot soldiers, and being quite angry and agitated and very explicit in their demands. So it was to a large extent non-organized, in say it was a spontaneous type of protest. It was not primarily driven by NGOs, although civil society actors and NGOs played a role in helping to coordinate and form in the background for these types of protest. And it was a reaction to the women from the women's feeling that their traditional role of quite empowered role were being taken away. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. We have another question asking you to expand on a case where a local village has sort of overthrown or pushed a proto-state to leave the village and no longer rule it. And the question is specifically, are there any such cases specifically under ISIS in particular? And what specific types of actions were used to get ISIS to leave the village?
Thank you very much. A very good question. I must confess that I'm a bit uncertain, and I need to go back and look in my notes. And I'm happy to come back. So feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to come back with the details. Because I cannot. It doesn't ring a bell when it comes to a local village being where a local village were liberated, so to say, by civil resistance actions. What we have seen is some cases where, especially in the Idlib province of northern Syria, where the Nusra Front have occupied different cities, and where the cities have organized themselves and thrown them out. And as I said, this shows that when it comes to study jihadist groups, we can see a variation across the different groups. There is more political opportunity or more room for maneuver from some rebel groups, and Nusra Front is one of those groups which generally have accepted more dissent and have been more listening in to sort of more attuned to the demands and from the civilian people. But I feel that I don't answer this question in a very good way. So I asked the questioner, the person with the questions, to please email.
Well, and you raise a great point, Isak, that any questions like this one that you don't have the answer now to, I will be able to send you, and then you can write it up, and I will send it out to all the registrants along in about a week or so, along with the recording of this webinar. So we can do that. And if there's other questions that we don't get to, because we're getting close to running out of time, I'll send you a couple of those, and then those will go out to participants as well. This, I don't know, but it looks like this may be the last question we could get to. But one participant is talking about your notion of pillars of support in civil resistance and pulling those away from a ruling regime. And so the questioner is asking, are there any examples that you know of through your research where campaigns or local people have sort of interrupted the sources of wealth of the proto-state, you know, like trying to interfere with oil fields or something like that, but really hitting sort of the material resources that the regime depends on?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a great question, and one thing that comes across immediately in my mind is the refusal to pay taxes, and which really cuts to the core. If you look at Mara Revkin's work, for instance, and some other scholars that looked into the institutions of ISIS, you can see that local taxes was quite important. Taxation was a quite important instrument for financing. And we see when we survey people in Mosul that refusing to pay taxes as a mean of resistance was quite prevalent, and especially among women. Women were quite active in this particular type. Partly that has to do with that women had control of the home economy to a larger extent than men, but also that this was an instrument for showing dissent or to resisting that was available to women. That was not that women who could not access other forms of resistance and displaying dissent and protest. So I think that I haven't seen sort of any examples of taking over oil wealth, sort of oil income, infrastructure, and so forth. But I think this with the taxation is a really important thing, and it cuts through the sources of wealth and the basic economic pillars of support of the Jihadist Proto-States.
Isak, we're at time. I will send you a few additional questions that have been coming in, and then I'll send it out to other people. I want to thank you so much, both for your research, but taking the time to share it with our international audience, and I really appreciate it. And among the audience is many members of the ICNC online class on people power right now, that we did this so it would also be a public one, but also be available to our students. So I really appreciate that. For the participants, oops, there we go. I just want to say thank you for listening. And then there's some resources where you can find us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. And then if you have additional questions that don't already show up in the question box, you can quick send them to me. And the final thing I'll say is once I end the webinar, there's a short survey for participants about how it worked for them, what was useful, what suggestions they have that might improve our webinars in the future. So I hope you'll stay around and fill out that survey for us. So everyone, thank you so much for participating today. And Isak, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care, everybody.